Welcome to a conversation about research into practice. We're at Unley Primary School today and I am with Lynn Wilkinson, who's a former senior lecturer from Flinders University, and Tam Yarrawi, who's a teacher at Unley Primary School, and Amy Reid, who's assistant principal here at Unley Primary School. And I'm Jill Colton. I'm the acting president of ALEA and a lecturer at the University of South Australia in Literacy and English. So Lynn doesn't know much about the project. We've invited her in today to hear about it and to participate in our conversation with us. So maybe if we start with you, Amy, and you can tell us a little bit about the project and your school.
So I began a conversation after I attended the ALEA National Conference in Melbourne. Peter Bowers was one of the keynote speakers. I'd heard from Lynn Anderson. We also heard from Fiona Wilkinson. And we were really inspired by the research that was coming out around spelling, and particularly a repertoire-based approach to the teaching of spelling, which differs from the traditional stage theory approach. We wanted to move beyond spelling as a rote learning practice, and we wanted to get students engaged and involved in thinking about spelling. And so I started, when I came back to school, a conversation with Tam as a classroom practitioner who has a passion for teaching literacy, and talked to her about maybe trialling some of the approaches that I'd heard about at the conference in her classroom. And Tam talked about how teachers were feeling at Unley Primary School in terms of their spelling practice.
There was a general sense of frustration with spelling practice. Lots of different variety of programs out there. That real rote learning approach where you're giving the children just certain words to memorise and learn, and it wasn't transferring into their writing, which is the goal of what we want spelling to be. There was a real passion for wanting a whole school approach, some consistency through to reception to Year 7, to start really seeing spelling translating into writing practice.
That doesn't surprise me. For the last 40 years almost, teachers have been worried about the spelling program that they run not transferring into children's writing. So we still haven't got it right, so I'm really interested to find out what you've done and what successes you've had.
To start off this project then, how did you get together? Because I came in as a academic mentor, I suppose, just to talk with you a little bit about doing some research in your classroom and what we can do with the data and where we can lead it to. I must admit though that you are the guys who did all the work. I was just here to come and observe in some lessons and talk with you and just add another dimension, I think, along the way. So do you want to talk a little bit about how you and I got together to do this project?
Sure. So I'm a representative on the ALEA SA Local Council, and Jill, you at the time I think were State Director, and that was a wonderful connection, a professional collaboration that Jill, I know you've got an interest in understanding what's happening in classrooms, and so we were only too happy to have you involved. And then the opportunity came up to apply for a research grant, and that really formalised our learning journey. We had begun exploring different practices in the classroom, but being able to formalise it through the research grant enabled us to invite you into the classroom, enabled us to set some goals around what we were going to do with our collaboration, Tam, and it engaged everyone, I suppose.
I'm a very strong believer in practitioner research as well. It's very much not about me coming in and saying to you, oh, do this, do this. It's about you talking to me about what you're doing and what you're excited about and what you're doing action research about, really, planning your inquiry into the teaching of spelling, doing some of the stuff and then reflecting back on it by using the data to think about, well, what was the impact of that? And then what do we want to do next with it, which in your case has been taking it across the whole school,
yes.
Which is quite amazing.
I've just wanted to jump in there, Jill, because I think what you did when you came in for our classroom visits for Tam is you made visible some of the practices that Tam would do as part of her routine classroom instruction. So I know you mentioned the wonderful meta language she uses to talk to kids around learning. Tam has a focus on talking about word noticing rather than rote traditional ways of learning spelling words, and you were able to celebrate that, and that was helpful.
Yeah.
That was a big change in practice too. I know when Amy was team teaching with me in the classroom, we kept having to really bite our tongue to not tell the pattern to the children, to allow them that chance of thinking, that spelling is that thinking activity, getting them really engaged in the different types of skills that they need to be a really good speller. And having you come in really gave me the opportunity for some feedback. You need to be reflecting as a teacher when you're trying something new, and often you're just in that moment with the children. So that was a really valuable thing for me to have you in there too, for that feedback.
Yeah, that word noticing, Lynn, I really noticed the word noticing, because for me it's about inquiry, and so inquiry is about what do you notice. In fact, it's like, as a researcher, what we do is we go in and notice things, and you're asking the children to notice things, so because they're inquiring. So I guess that word really jumped out for me, and we'll probably talk a little bit more about how you got the noticing happening, I guess, and how
it wasn't natural for every student, so that was a journey in itself.
Yeah.
Can I just backtrack a little bit, Jill, and ask if you had a research question or a research focus? What was that?
Our focus was to really just see if this inquiry approach to spelling wouldn't just target those high achieving spellers, but where you could do it across the board with all children and get results. Traditionally you had spelling groups, and what our concern was is that lower group that don't have the academic skills for spelling at that particular point, that they're missing out on some of that higher order thinking and patterns that we don't think they're ready for. Whereas this approach really looks at, from reception to year one, there's no hierarchical order. The kids in reception are doing etymology and looking at different morphemes and pieces of words. We had 3 students we were tracking, and I, out of interest, also tracked a really low child with a dyslexia disability, just to really see how effective it was.
You've identified the problem, like, really clearly, and you've also talked about it in the context just specifically of your class, Tam, and how you're looking at some of those students who are perhaps performing maybe just below average in their spelling, and you also included one other student who had a particular struggle with spelling that you also were interested in finding out what this inquiry approach to spelling, how that impacted on that child. And so I guess just before we go to what you found out from doing this research in your classroom, what did you do? Like, what was your plan? What did you decide to try out in your class?
Well, it was quite challenging, I think, to start with, because Amy had come back all inspired from just some of the professional development that she'd had, and we had no go-to tools. There's not one program to follow, so we really had a play.
That's right. Yeah.
Didn't we?
Yeah.
Drawing from Peter Bowers, some things that he'd done.
We at ALEA really have had a focus on equipping teachers with confidence to develop their professional expertise, and a shift away from purchasing an off-the-shelf commercial program. And so while that presented some challenges in gaining consistency in practice from reception to year 7, we also were really proud of the approach, because I think it values teachers' professional expertise. So we did have to draw upon a number of different resources and tools to inform our approach. And then we drew upon one of the wonderful resources developed by Christine Topfer, the Effective Spelling Teaching Guides. And when they were published, we got our hands on them as soon as we could. And they were a wonderful resource that built our professional expertise, but also gave us some examples of the practice that would be helpful in the classroom. But before we had that research, we engaged with children and set some learning goals around a particular area of spelling. And we're really careful not to tell students, but to ask students and encourage them to notice the particular pattern that they were exploring.
All right, so can you tell us more about that, Tam?
So I think we started with suffixes. From memory, it was maybe ed, suffix ed. Just the morphology makes sense, because if you look at even the ed suffix jumped, you hear a t sound. Sometimes you don't hear the ed. If we're relying just solely on that sounding out strategy. The children aren't being set up for success in that way. So if they are understanding ED means the past, no matter whether they hear a T or a different sound at the end, if they're writing a narrative, for example, set in the past, they should automatically know, I just know it's going to be an ED. So the one challenging part was, I think, that some students were used to just having the prescriptive pattern given to them. You had those natural inquirers that just really shone out, and like I said, Amy and I had to almost just bite our tongue to really get them to do the thinking, and there'd be leading questions like, what are you noticing? Trying to get children to all participate was a challenge at times, so you'd have to really encourage participation, really model and scaffold your question to get other children getting confident with inquiring too, which sometimes set them off on tasks. If we're looking at ED, can we find some more words yourselves? What do you notice? They had good fit books they borrowed from the library, which are picture books that we know they can read independently. They sit together in partners or groups with whiteboards and do a bit of investigating themselves. That's just touching on a little bit of what we experimented with.
Tam, could you talk about the literature that informs the spelling program as well? So that we'll always start with a
good, high quality a picture book or a high quality text. The loose framework that we've used now from Christina Toffler's resources is there's a tuning in activity where you're introducing a book. It might be they're just reading the picture book. You're getting the kids to maybe listen out for a particular sound, or you might have them recording some interesting words so you can make sure they're understanding the content of the picture book. And then you might pose a question with 3 words, what do you notice about them? And you're hoping at that point they're noticing what the inquiry is going to even be about. The next step is the explicitly noticing a pattern together. So you build on what the children are noticing and you're sort of scaffolding them to find out, again, without telling them exactly what the patterns are. The next step is they're searching for the patterns. So that might be going out, looking at good fit books, looking in within each other's writing. So very much more of a student-led. The trickier thing can be when there's, say, for example, you're adding an ED that comes with knowing about a base, dropping a letter, doubling a letter. So all of those little nuances, the hypotheses we called them, about those patterns, you're not wanting to tell the children that. So that was quite challenging at times, getting them to form that understanding. And our thoughts were, if they're really understanding what the pattern is themselves, they're more than likely to really remember it more.
I think that's absolutely true, and it fits with what we know about how children learn. Tam, I just wanted to ask you, you talked about good fit picture books, and that's, I mean, my heart is aglow that you're using literature, but I'm assuming you've got a lower grade level, have you? What grade level are you talking about?
I teach year 2.
Year 2s, yeah. Okay.
Mm-hmm. Well, when I came in one day, I think you were looking at the different ways that the A sound is made.
The long A, those long vowels.
Yeah.
So tricky for them to remember.
That's what I remember you were doing. Because you're thinking about those students who maybe aren't the high level spellers, just they're the ones that you were really focusing on and thinking about what was the impact of this. And I guess some people might say, well, if you're expecting them all to find the pattern, they have to find the pattern, and you're not telling them the pattern, they have to find it. What about the ones who don't find it? So I guess, I mean, how did you know who your students are? You know, I noticed that when I came in, you know them really well. You know who's going to just be able to go and fly with this. You know who's going to need a bit of extra sort of help and guidance. And that's what I saw you doing. So do you want to tell Lynn what you did around some of those different groups of children?
Yeah, that was a lot of brainstorming with Amy as well, because you're used to having those traditional groups where they're differentiated academically. And my concern was to not only lift those high flyers, but I couldn't get my head around originally, whole class, how am I going to target those kids that need it? Because we know if we don't hit those gaps, those poor middle primary teachers are then left with a very differentiated class. I don't know, naturally I think those kids that I just knew would go off, we're really focusing on student choice at the moment too in our school, so I'd give them the option, you can research, have a look on your own, and by that stage we'd already done that one explicit noticing patterns together as a class. So I was really confident those kids, either some chose to go on their own, some buddied up, some were in groups, And then I still had children who couldn't even read a good fit book, where their level, they might have been on a level 5 or 6 reader still. So I just kind of had them on the carpet, and rather than, let's say for long A, there's 4 or 5 different spelling patterns within that, I just focused, I think, on the split digraph one that was more common. So I had them down, I was reading them the book. As I'd read that long A word, I'd really emphasise it a bit more. So they were the ones noticing, got them to write that down. So really still having those children supported at that same time, narrowing their focus within the inquiry we worked out was one way to differentiate. We'd had the higher kids targeting all 5 different spelling patterns, and those kids that just really targeting one.
I think that's really important. Because sometimes people might think inquiry is everybody going, finding and noticing, but you thought about those children who would need a little bit more guidance, scaffolding, even a bit of explicitness around the patterns. And as you say, bringing it down so that there's less that they can focus on, so they can sort of consolidate it more carefully.
Because what we do know is that children who are able to use what they know to write words often use an acceptable letter combination but not a correct combination for that word. Yeah. And sometimes if you try and teach all the combinations, all the possible combinations at once, all it does is confuse them even more. So did you find that with your with the students who weren't high achievers with spelling, that it worked better to concentrate on perhaps one possible letter sequence at a time?
I think it did. And then what we would do with the SSO time that we have, because even within that 2-week inquiry, you'd do the, even the way we're assessing is quite different. If we're looking at spelling and writing, there's no point just testing words. So we'd give a dictation. For those children where that was tricky, you'd also give them some words with the spelling pattern, circle which one's correct, so you could at least see what level of spelling they understood. So more often than not, that post-dictation after the inquiry, most kids had made some significant progress. And the lower children were at least being able to do that one pattern we'd honed in on, and being able to drop in that pattern where it probably shouldn't be, but having some more reasonable, let's say if it was long A, some reasonable spelling decisions. But they would then obviously need that reoccurring practice. So once an inquiry is done, it's not just let's just move on to the next one. We then try to thread it through with writing through our mentor text. If we're talking about sentence structure and you're noticing those long vowels, you'd be zooming in on those too. So wherever you can, that really holistic approach to spelling, not just this is a spelling lesson and then we're moving on.
The other thing we were mindful of was that those children who might not be the high achieving in spelling had access to the thinking of more capable spelling learners. So often when we put them in a group, they're not able to hear the strategies that our highly effective spellers use. And so through that dialogic talk, that whole class approach with differentiation, those students were able to learn from one another.
That's such a good point, because I think sometimes children who are perhaps struggling a bit more are cut out of doing the inquiry approaches. It's right. Like, oh yeah, this group can, but no, you have to come and do some highly structured rote learning. And I mean, your approach is highly structured,
yes,
but it just has that inquiry, deeper thinking approach, and it enables that kind of thinking to be nurtured, I guess.
Absolutely.
And so you're not cutting out that group.
Yes.
You're allowing that group into this way of teaching spelling. So I'm really interested to know about your results and what you found out. What kind, I guess, the data you collected, what you did with that. What did you learn from doing this?
We found even from just interviewing students that when we asked about what good spellers do, it really was just sounding out words. And how would you teach a friend of yours who doesn't know a word? I'd sound out the sounds for them. And we just,
so that was the interview that was before we started this?
Yes, before we started. So it really showcased that was just that sole strategy. And when children can't hear, those sounds, they've got nothing else to draw upon.
So the repertoire approach, the students draw upon the morphology of words, the orthography and the phonology, and in some middle and upper primary, the etymology as well. And certainly our Australian curriculum from reception talks about students understanding the meaningful parts of words, so that's the morphology. And so that was a bit of a shift in our thinking, ensuring that students could draw upon a range of spelling strategies from the very earliest of ages. And when we ask students now about what strategies effective spellers use, they are able to share the strategies. They wouldn't. The meta language that they use is that we can talk about the sounds of words, the meaning of words, make some connections between some words that we already know. What are some other strategies? The checking strategy.
I'm just thinking, it sounds like you've been a bit influenced by Misty Adonio's work.
That's
too.
right. Yeah. And Misty often talks about that our struggling spellers, we give them more of their weakest point. So if they've got difficulties with phonological awareness or hearing the sounds of words, we give them more of the same, which is the point where they struggle. And actually there's been a range of compelling research to show that morphological instruction can help our weaker spellers as well. So it's about having the repertoire.
And that's not surprising, because English is not a phonetic language.
That's right.
No.
English maintains the morphemes, the morphology, so that the meaning is preserved, which is why you get a word like breadcrumb, where you can't hear B on the end when you say it, but if you say crumble, it's absolutely there. So morphology is critical, and I have to say that it's incredibly reassuring to hear practitioners talking about the range of information that students need if they're going to be good spellers, because an over-reliance on phonics or phonological information is actually detrimental to children. They do the T at the end of jumped, or they do a Z at the end of dogs, rather than thinking, oh, that's a plural, I need an S, IES, ES, whatever it is. So I think it's absolutely fantastic.
Yeah, I do too.
We're really proud of it. And it's not necessarily a popular approach, but we're really strong around looking at the Australian curriculum, looking at what the research is telling us, and drawing upon the repertoire theory.
Amy, at the beginning of the conversation you talked about rolling this out right across the school. So was TAM's study like a pilot study?
It was an intentional instructional leadership strategy from my perspective, is that it's always wonderful to engage with a teacher who has energy and the passion and the appetite for trying something new and increasing their professional learning. And when that became successful and we had some reflections that we could learn from, and then when we went to another class to try and replicate a similar approach, we were one step ahead from being able to change our practice based on some of the learnings from Tam's class. But it really draws upon the work of Simon Breakspear, who talks about in schools incubating an idea on a smaller scale and then amplifying it across a larger scale. And so it was wonderful because colleagues were able to hear directly from Tam, who provided a first-hand account of the way that it had changed her practice, and of the evidence, I suppose, that you had gained from your students.
Because if you're rolling at a whole school approach, why? There'd have to be some results to really rejig and change practice. And I know then we had my class, I think there was a year one class as well, and reception. So when you do roll it out whole school, it's not just Amy being inundated with questions, there's lots of support where teachers are sharing practice and learning from one another.
And what I've noticed is that you've drawn on research, you've done your own research, you've created your own evidence, and then you've used your evidence to talk to the rest of the school community and to implement and roll out, I guess, this kind of approach, but still within a lot of reflective practice from those other teachers as well. like you said before, it's very heartwarming to hear of the amazing work you've put in and the thought. And, thank you, Tam, especially for your work in the classroom, because I know you've done a lot of work there, and for Amy of getting this out to the whole school as well. Yeah, really wonderful to see. So
absolutely inspiring. Absolutely
well, it's lovely
inspiring.
now. And now it's not just me. I know last year at staff meetings there'd be PD around spelling, and whether it's middle primary, upper primary, junior primary, all had an opportunity to showcase what they were all doing. So although it started in my room, there are so many teachers that are just, ensconced in this lovely, it actually makes sense to teach spelling this way now that we're doing it. So there's so many teachers that are really implementing this approach now, getting some great results, which is wonderful.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, I'm so glad we've been able to talk about this today.
Thank you.
And
Thank you.
I think that's we've talked about it, and that I think we'll finish the conversation.